The sky over Dry Willow, Texas, did not ease into the storm. In the year of our Lord 1881, nature seldom asked permission. One moment, the sun was a merciless hammer in a vast, bleached blue sky, beating the dust into a fine powder that coated every surface. The next, the blue was gone, swallowed by a bruised, purple-bellied mass that rolled in from the west without a whisper of wind. The air grew thick, still, and heavy with the scent of ozone and parched earth about to receive a violent baptism. Then the world exploded. It wasn't rain, it was ice. The first stones were the size of peas, a harmless rattling against the corrugated tin roof of Dane Whitlow's barn. But they were only the vanguard. Within a minute, they were the size of marbles. Then acorns, then jagged chunks of ice as big as a man's thumb. They didn't fall. They were fired from the heavens. A celestial volley of ammunition that screamed as it descended. The hammering on the roof became a deafening roar, a relentless drumming that vibrated through the wooden beams and down into the packed dirt floor. Tin buckled and tore, leaving pockmarks that let in slivers of the furious gray light. Outside, the herd of new calves, barely a month old, scattered in blind panic. Their bewildered cries were thin threads of sound, torn apart by the gale. They were creatures of sun and dry grass, and this brutal, cold assault was a terror beyond their comprehension. Dane Whitlow was in the thick of it. He didn't run for cover. His hat had been ripped from his head and sent sailing into the maelstrom. Ice stones pelted his shoulders and back, striking with the force of thrown rocks. He ignored the stinging blows. His entire focus narrowed to a single point of desperation. A newborn calf, the last of the season, had collapsed, its spindly legs folding beneath it. It lay shivering, too stunned to even cry out. Dane hunched over the small creature, making a shield of his own body. He tucked its head under his arm, his hands, bare and raw, pressing against its trembling flank. He could feel the frantic, shallow beat of its heart against his calloused palms. The ice struck his knuckles, splitting the skin. He didn't flinch. The cold was a searing pain, but it was distant. All that mattered was the fragile life beneath him. His land was hard, his water was scarce, and every head of cattle was a bulwark against the ruin that always stalked the edges of a place like Dry Willow. He would not lose this one, not to a sky gone mad. A quarter-mile east, Tess Marlowe fought her own battle against the storm. Her school wasn't much, just a large canvas tent stretched over a wooden frame, its floorboards laid directly on the thirsty ground. It was a transient place for a transient population, a small bastion of letters and sums in a world governed by brands and bullets. The wind tore at the canvas, threatening to rip the grommets from their moorings. The hailstones hammered against the fabric with wet, percussive thuds. With a length of rope clenched between her teeth, Tess wrestled with a corner flap that had come loose. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was plastered to her scalp and cheeks. Streaming water, her simple calico dress was soaked through, clinging to her frame and offering no protection from the biting cold. As she strained to pull the canvas taut and lash it to the corner post, her gaze kept straying west, toward the Whitlow ranch. Through the gray, shifting curtain of ice and rain, she could just make out a figure in the open pasture, a man hunched over something small. It had to be Whitlow. Even from this distance, the image was one of absolute, unyielding stubbornness. It was exactly what the whispers in town had led her to expect. Dane Whitlow, they said at the general store, was a man made from the same rock and grit as the land he worked. He'd bought the old Bar W spread 5 years ago and had spoken fewer than 500 words to the town since. His words, when they came, were clipped and sharp, honed to a fine edge of impatience. He's a bachelor by choice. The women would murmur over their sewing circles. No woman would put up with a disposition as sour as last year's milk. His ranch was called Dry Willow for a reason. The North Fork Creek that bordered his property had been dwindling for years, and his patch of earth was perpetually thirsty. The man, they said, was as dry and ungiving as his land. Tess had seen him in town a handful of times. A tall man with shoulders broadened by labor, a face weathered by sun and wind into a mask of stoic indifference. His eyes, the one time she'd been close enough to notice, were a startlingly clear gray, the color of the sky just before a storm like this one. They were eyes that watched and judged and gave nothing away. She also knew what he was up against, what they were all up against. It wasn't just the unforgiving land and the violent weather. A new predator had come to Dry Willow, one who wore a velvet-collared coat and polished boots. Price Talon, the railroad's water contractor. He spoke in smooth, reasonable tones about progress and shared prosperity. He laid out maps on the saloon tables, pointing with a manicured finger at the path of a grand new canal that would, he promised, make the valley bloom. All he needed, he said with an easy smile, were the water rights to the North Fork, just a signature on a piece of paper, a formality, to ensure the future for everyone. Tess had seen the pressure in his eyes. The subtle threat coiled beneath the pleasantries. He was picking off the ranchers one by one, making offers that were just a little too low, applying pressure in ways you couldn't quite prove. He was a patient man, a man who knew that thirst was a powerful negotiating tool, and Dane Whitlow, with his dwindling section of the creek, was squarely in Talon's sights. A final, vicious tug on the rope, and the knot held. The canvas shuddered, but it was secure. Tess leaned against the post, catching her breath, the icy water dripping from her nose and chin. She looked back toward Whitlow's ranch. The figure was still there, an unmoving rock in a churning sea. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the storm broke. The roar subsided to a dull drumming, then to a soft patter, and finally to a dripping silence. The bruised clouds cracked open, and a weak, watery sunlight spilled onto a landscape that looked shattered. The ground was white with ice, glittering like a field of broken glass. The air was sharp and cold, smelling of bruised sagebrush and wet earth. Tess didn't wait. She ducked back into her tent, her boots squelching on the damp floorboards. From a sturdy wooden chest that served as both storage and a student's desk, she retrieved her medical bag. It was heavy leather, worn smooth with use, filled with tinctures, bandages, and the tools of her trade. She was the town's teacher, yes, but her father had been a doctor, and he had taught her everything he knew. In a place like Dry Willow, 100 miles from the nearest established physician, her skills were often the only thing standing between a fever and a fresh grave. She grabbed a small, dark blue bottle containing a potent respiratory tincture, a mix of mullein and horehound she'd prepared herself. Cold shock could kill a newborn calf as surely as a wolf. Its lungs would fill, and its body would surrender to the fever. Without a second thought, she slung the bag over her shoulder and started for the Whitlow Ranch. The ground was treacherous, slick with melting ice and mud. She moved with a steady, practiced gait, her eyes fixed on the barn where she could see Dane now herding the terrified remnants of his small herd. He didn't see her approach until she was at the gate to his corral. He was kneeling in the mud beside the same calf, running his hands over its body, checking for breaks. He looked up as her shadow fell over him. His gray eyes narrowed with suspicion. His face was streaked with mud, and a fresh cut, red and angry, stood out on his cheekbone where a hailstone had struck. "Whitlow," she said, her voice even, not bothering with pleasantries. He didn't answer. He just watched her, his expression a wall of wary dislike. "I brought something for the calves," she continued, holding up the blue bottle. "For their lungs. The cold can get into them." He stared at the bottle, then back at her face. For a long moment, she thought he would refuse. She saw the rigid set of his jaw, the pride that was as much a part of him as his bones. Dane Whitlow didn't take help? That was another one of the rumors. And this one, she could see, was true. To accept her medicine would be an admission of need, a crack in the solitary fortress he had built around himself. She held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering practical help, a tool, just as a blacksmith might offer to mend a broken hinge. This was the language she hoped he would understand. The silence stretched, broken only by the dripping of water from the barn eaves and the miserable lowing of a calf. He looked from her face to the bottle, and then down at the shivering animal at his feet. Its breath was already coming in shallow, raspy pants. That sound seemed to decide it for him. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was a rough, ungracious movement, more a twitch of a muscle than a gesture of acceptance. But it was enough. Tess walked through the gate and knelt in the mud across from him. She uncorked the bottle, the sharp, herbal scent cutting through the cold air. "You'll have to get it down them," she instructed, her voice all business. "A few drops for the small ones. It will help clear the fluid." He took the bottle from her without a word. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second. His skin was ice cold and rough as sandstone. He went to work, cradling the first calf's head, tipping the medicine into its mouth with a surprising gentleness. Tess rose and walked toward the barn porch, giving him space. She leaned against a support post, her weariness settling in deep in her bones. From here, she could hear it, a sound she had grown accustomed to over the past months, as familiar as the call of the mourning doves at dawn, the sound of the North Fork Creek. But it was wrong. The usual steady murmur, the sound of life-giving water flowing over stones, was gone. In its place was a feeble trickle, a thin, weak whisper that spoke of a dying flow. It was the sound of a voice fading, of a pulse weakening. Her stomach tightened. Dane finished with the last calf and walked over to the porch, the empty bottle still in his hand. He stood a few feet from her, not looking at her, but looking out toward the low hills where the creek bent out of sight. He heard it, too. His whole body went still, his posture hardening into something as rigid and unmoving as a statue. "Someone's blocked it," he said. His voice was a low rasp, flat and devoid of emotion, but the anger beneath it was a palpable thing, like heat rising from dry ground. "Talon," Tess said, the name leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. He didn't need to affirm it. They both knew. With the ranchers weakened and their livestock threatened by the storm, Price Talon was making his move, tightening his grip on the town's very lifeline. Tess pushed herself off the post, her mind already shifting from the immediate crisis to the one that would follow. The calves were safe from the cold for now, but a more insidious threat was coming. "The ones that took the worst of the ice," she said, her tone sharp and clinical. "They'll be prone to lung fever. You'll need to watch them through the night." She looked at him directly, her eyes meeting his. "Don't be gentle with the fever in those calves tonight. Mr. Whitlow, you hit it hard, and you hit it fast." It was a doctor's advice, stern and practical, but in the charged silence that hung between them, it felt like something more. It was an acknowledgement of the world they lived in, a place that had no room for softness, that punished hesitation. It was a declaration of a shared understanding. Dane's gaze dropped from her eyes to the small, white handkerchief she had tucked into her sleeve. It was a simple, clean square of fabric, a small, almost defiant piece of order in the muddy chaos of his world. He looked at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into the back pocket of his worn denim trousers and pulled out his heavy leather work gloves. He didn't put them on. He held them for a second before stuffing them deep into his front pocket. The act felt strangely significant, like a man holstering a weapon or putting away a shield. A chill that had nothing to do with the melting hail settled over the porch. It was the cold of unspoken things, of a shared danger that had drawn two solitary people into a fragile, unwilling alliance. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the battered land. Far in the distance, a single light flickered to life. It was the crimson glow of the lanterns being lit at the Black Spur Saloon, a warm and inviting light in the deepening twilight. But they both knew it was a deceptive warmth. It was the place where men like Talon made their deals, and where the poison of rumor and speculation was brewed and served. Night after night, the dawn that followed the hailstorm was deceptively gentle. It painted the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and gold, colors that promised warmth and lied about the day to come. For Tess Marlowe, the day began before the sun had fully crested the horizon. The damp chill of the earth seeped up through the floorboards of her tent school, but she was already at work. By the time the first shafts of light slanted across the muddy ground, a line had formed outside her canvas flap. This was her other classroom, her other calling. A small, hand-painted sign read, T. Marlowe, Remedies Reading, a dual promise to the body and the mind. The children came first, their small faces pale in the early light, their coughs echoing in the crisp air. She moved among them with a quiet efficiency, her fingers gentle as she checked for fevers, her voice low and soothing as she administered doses of elderberry syrup. The mothers stood by, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. Payment was not made in coin, a currency as scarce as deep water and dry willow. Instead, they bartered. A warm cornbread muffin, wrapped in a clean cloth, was exchanged for a poultice for a scraped knee. A small jar of preserved peaches secured a bottle of cough expectorant. It was a fragile economy of care and necessity, and Tess was its quiet center. She saw the worry in their eyes, a reflection of the town's own. The dwindling creek was not just a rancher's problem. It was a fever in the town's bloodstream, miles away. Dane Whitlow was conducting his own morning inventory, and it had nothing to do with medicine. He stood by the main gate to his south pasture, his hands on his hips, his gray eyes narrowed to slits. The top hinge of the heavy wooden gate sagged, pulled nearly free of the post. He ran a bare thumb over the wood. It wasn't a clean break from stress or age. The fibers were ragged, torn. He knelt, examining the thick rope latch. It had been sawed, not neatly, but with a rough, hurried aggression. Someone had worked at it in the dark, hacking it through until it was just a few strands from giving way. A strong wind, or the press of a few curious cows, and the entire herd would have been out, scattered across the open range, or, worse, driven into a ravine. It was a petty act, a piece of slow-burning malice meant to wear him down, to add one more weight to the burdens he already carried. It was the work of a coward, and he knew who employed cowards in this valley. He straightened up, his jaw tight. He didn't waste time on anger. Anger was a luxury. Instead, he fetched his tools. The rasp of his file against the new metal bracket was a sharp, grating sound in the morning stillness, a lonely note of repair in a world intent on breaking things. In the heart of the small, dusty town, Price Talon was also at work. Though his tools were far more refined, he sat in the sheriff's office, which also served as the mayor's parlor and the town clerk's registry. The room smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Talon, in his fine wool coat with a velvet collar, seemed entirely out of place, a sleek predator in a den of prairie dogs. He poured a generous measure of amber whiskey into a glass and pushed it across the desk toward Mayor Thompson, a man whose authority was as faded as his tin star. To the future, Mayor, Talon said, his voice as smooth as the liquor. A future of abundance. You hold the water, you hold the power to grow. The railroad brings the world to your doorstep, and my canal will turn this dust bowl into a garden. Thompson, a man whose face was a roadmap of indecision, picked up the glass. The folks are worried. Price, Whitlow's not the only one. The creek is lower than I've ever seen it. Talon smiled, a patient, knowing expression. Hard times require hard decisions, a temporary inconvenience for a permanent prosperity. Once the rights are consolidated, the work can begin in earnest. We must think of the greater good. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And for those who see the wisdom in selling now, well, let's just say the railroad is prepared to be a good neighbor. Tess heard the tail end of that conversation. She had come to the mercantile next door to replenish her supply of bandages. The wall between the two establishments was little more than thin, unseasoned pine, and voices carried. As she measured out a length of cotton, she heard Talon's man, a slick-haired clerk named Davies, laying out the terms to the shopkeeper. $1 an acre for any land with a dry creek bed. Davies was saying. "The offer's only good for a week. Once the survey is done, the price will plummet. Talon's doing them a favor, really, giving them a way out before they're holding worthless dirt. $1 an acre. It was less than theft. It was erasure. It was a price designed to prey on desperation, to turn the manufactured drought into a land grab." Tess's hands tightened on the bolt of cotton. She paid the shopkeeper, her face a mask of calm, and walked back out into the harsh sunlight, the clerk's words echoing in her mind. She found Dane at the town well later that morning. It was the only source of water not dependent on the North Fork, and its level, too, was dropping. He was hauling up a bucket, the rope creaking in protest. The cut on his cheek from the hailstorm was an angry red line. He hadn't cleaned it properly. Tess walked up to him, her medical bag in hand. She didn't greet him. She simply opened her bag and took out a small tin containing antiseptic salve and a clean safety pin holding a folded piece of linen. "That cut will get infected," she said, her voice flat and direct. She held out the pin and salve. "Keep it clean." He stopped winding the rope and looked at her, then at the simple offering in her hand. A flicker of something annoyance. Surprise passed through his eyes before the curtain of indifference dropped again. He took the pin and the small tin from her. Their fingers didn't touch this time. "Appreciate it," he grunted. It was a single, clipped word, ground out from a place of reluctance. He dropped the items into his shirt pocket and turned back to the well, the set of his shoulders a clear dismissal. The conversation, such as it was over. That evening, Tess had to go to the Black Spur Saloon. Old Man Hemlock, the proprietor, had a recurring ague, and she had promised to bring him a fresh supply of willow bark tonic. Pushing through the swinging doors was like stepping into another world. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, stale smoke, and unwashed bodies. A tinny piano was being hammered at in the corner, and the low roar of male voices filled the space. Her presence caused a momentary lull. A woman in the Black Spur was a rare sight, and a woman like Tess Marlowe was an anomaly. A few of the ranch hands from the Circle C, their wits dulled by drink, saw her and grinned. "Well, looky here," one of them called out, his voice slurring. "It's the good doctor. Say, Doc, you got a cure for loneliness." A wave of coarse laughter followed. Tess didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply turned her head and looked directly at the man who had spoken. Her gaze was steady, clear, and utterly unimpressed. She held it for 3 long seconds, saying nothing, letting the silence and her own quiet dignity answer for her. The man's grin faltered. He looked down into his beer, suddenly finding it fascinating. The laughter died in their throats. Tess turned her back on them and walked to the bar, delivered the tonic to Hemlock, and left without another word. She had learned long ago that some fights were won not with a sharp tongue, but with a straight spine. Later that night, the silence that fell over Dry Willow was a thin, fragile thing. The coyotes began their nightly chorus, their yips and howls carrying on the cold, clear air. And then another sound joined them. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable to anyone who listened for it. A sharp, metallic clang, followed by the grating squeal of a heavy iron wheel being turned on a threaded bolt. It was the sound of a gate valve being closed, somewhere up the North Fork. In the darkness, Price Talon was tightening the noose, in her tent, by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Tess sat at her small writing desk. She dipped her pen in the inkwell, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the small space. She wasn't writing a letter or a lesson plan. She was writing in her journal, her own private ledger of the world. "Be gentle with the patient," she wrote, the script neat and precise. "Be firm with the affliction." She paused, looking at the words. Then she dipped the pen again and added a new line beneath it. "Be hard as nails with the man who closes the gate," in Dane Whitlow's barn. The air was warm and smelled of hay, animals, and the clean scent of the respiratory tincture Tess had given him. He had chosen not to sleep. He sat on an overturned bucket in the central aisle, a small, contained fire burning in a metal drum beside him. It cast a flickering golden light on the rough-hewn wooden walls. The sickest of the calves were penned nearby, their breathing still shallow but steadier now. He was alone, as he always was. But tonight, it felt different. The small blue bottle sat on a ledge near the lantern, a foreign object in his stark world. Her advice echoed in his head. Don't be gentle. He understood. It was the first law of this land, a law he had lived by his entire life. To hear it from her, spoken with such clear-eyed certainty, was unsettling. It was like hearing his own grim thoughts spoken aloud in a voice that was not his own. He was alone, but he was no longer the only one who saw the fight for what it was. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks toward the rafters. The flames threw his shadow, long and solitary, against the far wall of the barn. At the same time, the angle of the light caught the edge of the open barn door, stretching across the muddy yard and just touching the canvas of the school tent a quarter-mile away. For a fleeting, impossible moment, the light from his fire cast another, softer shadow beside his own on the barn wall. It was the faint, distant silhouette of her tent. Two shadows, thrown by a single flame, one sharp and hard-edged, the other indistinct and wavering. They didn't touch, but they shared the same light, thin and trembling, and, against the vast, encroaching darkness, strangely durable. The knock on Dane Whitlow's door came long after midnight, a frantic, desperate pounding that was utterly alien to the deep silence of his nights. He was awake, sitting in a simple wooden chair tipped back against the wall of his small cabin, listening to the rasping breaths of the calves in the nearby barn. The fire in his hearth had burned down to glowing embers, providing just enough light to see the shape of things. He was on his feet before the second volley of knocks, grabbing his holster from a peg by the door out of pure instinct. He didn't draw the pistol, but his hand rested on the worn leather grip. Trouble that came in the dead of night was seldom the kind that could be reasoned with. He pulled the door open a crack. Tess Marlowe stood on his stoop, her face a pale oval in the darkness, illuminated by the lantern she held aloft. Rain, a fine, persistent drizzle, beaded on her hair and shoulders. Her expression was stripped of everything but raw urgency. "It's Jonas," she said, her voice tight, wasting no time on preamble. "Martha's boy. He's taken a fever, a bad one. He's convulsing. I need to get him to my tent where I have the proper medicines. But his mother can't carry him. I need your wagon. Whitlow. Now." He didn't ask questions. He saw the truth of the crisis in her eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod, pulled the door shut just long enough to shove his feet into his boots, and emerged a moment later, shrugging into a heavy coat. The drizzle was cold, and the world was wrapped in a thick, damp darkness that swallowed the light from her lantern just a few feet from its source. The air smelled of wet dust and sage. Hitching the two sturdy horses to the flatbed wagon was a swift, practiced series of movements in the dark. Tess held the lantern high, its light dancing over the leather and brass of the harnesses. Dane worked in silence, his motions economical and sure. Within minutes, they were on their way, the wagon wheels cutting soft ruts in the rain-slicked track that passed for a road. They found Martha Hale kneeling beside her son on the dirt floor of their tiny sod house, her face a mask of terror. Jonas, a boy of no more than 7, was rigid, his small body arched and trembling, a low, guttural sound catching in his throat. His skin was slick with sweat but burned with a fever that Tess could feel from a foot away. "We have to move him," Tess said, her voice dropping into a calm, authoritative tone that belied the fear in her own heart. "Dane, if you would." Dane moved forward and, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, slid his arms beneath the boy's back and knees. He lifted Jonas as if he weighed nothing, the child's stiff body wrapped in a threadbare quilt. He carried him out into the rain and laid him carefully on a bed of empty grain sacks they had thrown onto the wagon bed. Tess climbed up beside the boy, her medical bag already open. Martha, weeping silently, scrambled up to sit at her son's head. The journey back to Tess's tent was a nightmare of slow, agonizing progress. The rain had turned the road into a slick, greasy ribbon of mud. The horses strained, their hooves sucking and pulling at the mire. Dane kept them at a steady, bone-jarring walk, his hands firm on the reins, his eyes narrowed, trying to read the treacherous ground in the swaying puddle of lamplight. Tess was bent over Jonas, trying to administer a tincture of valerian root to ease the seizure, the liquid spilling from the corner of the boy's clenched jaw. They were halfway there, at a low point in the road where the water pooled, when it happened. The right front wheel, seeking purchase, slid sideways and dropped with a sickening lurch into a deep, unseen rut. The wagon pitched violently. The horses whinnied and fought for footing. The axle groaned and then settled with a final, solid thud against the hard edge of the rut. They were stuck, fast. "Get them to pull," Tess cried out, not looking up from the boy. Dane's voice was a low growl of effort. "Ha, get up." He snapped the reins, and the horses threw their weight into the harnesses. The leather creaked, the wagon shuddered and groaned, but the wheel wouldn't budge. It was wedged tight, the axle resting hard on the unyielding earth. "They can't get purchase," Dane said, his voice grim. He set the brake, the sound of the iron lever locking into place unnervingly final. Tess looked up, her face stark in the lantern light. Jonas's convulsions had subsided, but his breathing was shallow, a terrifyingly faint flutter in his chest. The fever was still raging. Every wasted second was a victory for the sickness that was consuming him. She looked from the boy's pale face to Dane's silhouette at the front of the wagon. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his back, panic, cold and sharp. Tried to claw its way up her throat, but she shoved it down. Panic was a luxury. She slid off the wagon, her boots sinking into the cold, thick mud. She went to the front and held the lantern up to the stuck wheel. It was worse than she thought. The axle was buried, the wheel jammed at an impossible angle. Gentle persuasion was useless here. Pulling and coaxing would only exhaust the horses and sink them deeper. They needed force, raw, brute force. She looked at Dane. He had climbed down and was standing beside her, staring at the mired wheel, his expression grim. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat. In that moment, all the town's gossip, all their cautious distance from one another, evaporated. They were two people in the dark, fighting a common enemy, and they were losing. Tess met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a desperate intensity. She thought of her words to him on his porch after the hailstorm. Don't be gentle with the fever. The principle was the same. The situation demanded the same ruthlessness. I don't want gentle tonight. Whitlow, she said, her voice low and sharp, each word cutting through the sound of the rain. The words were for the wagon, for the mud, for the situation, but they hung in the air between them, charged with the night's desperation. We need to be rough. We need to get it up and out, now. A lesser man might have misunderstood. A man from the saloons might have grinned, his mind twisting the words into something cheap and suggestive. But Dane Whitlow looked into her eyes and saw not a woman, but a commander on a battlefield, a doctor fighting for a life. He saw the fire in her, the same unyielding stubbornness that he recognized in himself. He understood her language perfectly. It was the language of survival. Without a word, he turned, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled off his thick leather work gloves. He tossed them onto the driver's seat. He knelt, plunging his bare hands deep into the freezing, gritty mud beneath the axle. The cold had to be a shock, a searing pain, but his face remained a mask of stone. He worked his hands underneath the thick oak axle, finding a purchase. When I lift, he grunted, the words tight with coming strain. Get the horses to pull. Hard. Tess scrambled back to the driver's seat, grabbing the reins. She saw the muscles in Dane's back and shoulders bunch beneath his wet coat. She saw his jaw clench. Now he roared, a sound torn from his very core. He heaved upwards. It seemed an impossible task, lifting a quarter of the wagon's weight from the sucking mud. The veins stood out on his neck and arms, stark and corded in the lantern light. A low groan of pure, animal effort escaped his lips. The axle shifted, just an inch, scraping against the dirt. Now! Tess, he yelled again. She snapped the reins, screaming at the horses, her voice raw. Pull, pull the animals! Sensing the shift, surged forward. The wagon groaned. The wedged wheels scraped and fought the mud, and then, with a great, tearing, sucking sound, it came free. The wagon lurched forward a few feet onto more solid ground. Dane fell to his knees in the mud, his head hanging, his breath coming in great, ragged gasps. Tess leaped down, her heart pounding. She ran to Jonas. The boy had taken a breath, a real one. And another. His body was limp now, the terrible rigidity gone. The fever was still there, but the immediate crisis had passed. Tess bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. A wave of relief so profound it left her weak. She looked back at Dane. He was pushing himself to his feet, his hands and forearms coated in a thick black sheath of mud and gravel. He wiped his face with the back of a sleeve, leaving a long, dark smear across his cheek. She went to him, her steps unsteady. The small, enclosed space of the night seemed to vibrate with the aftermath of their shared effort. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, the sweat of horses and man, the sharp, herbal smell of the medicine on her hands. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. He just nodded, still breathing heavily, and walked to the front of the wagon to gather the reins. Back at her tent, they carried Jonas inside and laid him on a cot near the small pot-bellied stove, while Martha sobbed quietly, stroking her son's hair. Tess worked, sponging the boy down, forcing a fever-reducing tea between his lips. Dane built up the fire in the stove, his movements efficient and silent, until the small space was filled with a dry, steady warmth. When the boy was finally sleeping, his breathing deep and even, Tess walked a numb and exhausted Martha back to her home. When she returned, she found Dane sitting on the top step of her makeshift porch, waiting. He had washed the worst of the mud from his hands in her water barrel. He stood up as she approached. The adrenaline that had sustained her was gone, and in its place was a deep, bone-aching weariness. A tremor started in her right hand, a reaction to the strain and the fear. She tried to clench her fist to still it, but it only made it worse. She was a healer. Her hands were her most important tools, and she could not command them. Dane saw it. He stepped forward. Before she could protest or pull away, he gently took her wrist. He didn't say a word. He simply wrapped his large, calloused fingers around it, his thumb pressing lightly against the frantic pulse point on the inside of her wrist. His hand was steady and warm, a solid anchor in the shaky aftermath of the night. He just held it, his gray eyes watching her face, until the wild, panicked thrum of her pulse slowed, and the trembling in her fingers finally ceased. He released her. The moment was broken, but the feeling of his hand, the quiet, steady strength of it, lingered on her skin. The story, of course, did not end there. A lone rider, heading back to town from a late-night card game, had seen the wagon stuck in the road. He had heard Tess's desperate cry, "I don't want gentle tonight," by the time the sun rose. The tale was already slithering through the dust of dry willow, taking on a new and ugly shape in the telling. In the Black Spur Saloon, it became a joke, passed from man to man with a nudge and a wink. The respectable schoolteacher and the hermit rancher, stuck in the mud in the dead of night. The words were repeated, stripped of their context, twisted into something coarse and cheap. The laughter was loud and brittle, the kind men used to fill empty spaces in their own lives. News of the gossip reached Tess by mid-afternoon, delivered by a well-meaning but flustered mother. Tess's reaction was a faint, bitter smile. Dane found her reinforcing the lashing on her tent, the same one that had come loose in the hailstorm. He stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable. "I heard what they're saying in town," he said, his voice a low rumble. Tess didn't stop her work, pulling a knot tight with a sharp tug. Words are just air. Whitlow. She looked at him then, her eyes clear and direct. Let them talk. He watched her for a long moment. He saw no shame in her, no fear, only a weary sort of defiance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his work gloves, the leather still damp. Slowly, Methodically, he pulled them on, smoothing the fingers, hiding his bare hands from the world once more. He did not argue. He did not offer to defend her honor. That was not his way. Instead, he gave her the only thing he had to offer: his quiet agreement. His presence was its own statement. They stood there for a moment on the worn wooden steps, the silence stretching between them. It was a silence that was different from all the others that had passed between them. It felt like an oath, taken without words. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something harder, something forged in mud and desperation and necessity. It was a choice to stand on the same side of a line, far up the valley, hidden by a grove of cottonwoods. Another choice was being made. Price Talon stood by the headgate of the North Fork Creek, a wrench in his hand. With a final, satisfying grunt, he gave the valve wheel another full turn, closing it down even further, choking the flow of water to a barely perceptible trickle. The whisper of the dying creek was a sound he found deeply satisfying. The sun was not yet a presence in the sky, merely a promise bleeding along the eastern rim of the world. When Dane Whitlow found the first clue, he had been tracing the edge of the pitifully narrow North Fork Creek on his property, his eyes scanning the muddy banks not for what was there, but for what was missing the water. It was then he saw it, a set of deep boot prints, nearly washed away by the previous night's rain, but still discernible. They were not his own. What held his attention, however, was the mud itself, clinging to the edges of the print, and in a scattered trail leading away from the creek bed. The dark, wet earth glittered with tiny, silvery flecks. He knelt, scraping a small sample onto his fingertip. Mica. The soil on his land was heavy clay, reddish-brown and dull. This mud, flecked with shimmering stone, had been carried here on a man's boots. It was foreign. It was a trail. He didn't have to go for Tess. She was already walking toward him from her tent, a tin mug of coffee in her hand. She had seen him from her doorway, a solitary figure silhouetted against the pale dawn, and knew from his posture that he had found something. She walked up beside him, her gaze following his to the glittering mud. "That's not from around here," she said. It wasn't a question. "The soil in the upper canyon has that, up past the old quarry." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his gray eyes that she knew the land so well. "The railroad survey line runs through there," he said, his voice a low rumble. They didn't discuss it further. The decision was made in the silent space between them. Tess went back to her tent, only to exchange her dress for a man's pair of sturdy denim trousers and a durable shirt she kept for difficult work, and to slip her medical bag over her shoulder. Dane saddled his horse, but they didn't ride. A horse would be too easily seen, too easily heard. They would follow the trail on foot. They moved north, following the dwindling ghost of the creek. The path was quiet and tense. The only sounds were the soft tread of their boots on the damp ground and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high in the ever-brightening sky. They followed the tracks of mud, sometimes clear, sometimes faint, always leading upstream. It was a quiet investigation, a conversation held with the earth itself. The clues were physical, undeniable. A broken branch here, a dislodged rock there. Someone had passed this way recently, and in a hurry. After nearly an hour of walking, the landscape changed. The rolling hills gave way to a narrow, rock-strewn canyon. The air grew cooler, and the sound of the creek, which had faded to a whisper, was replaced by a new sound. It was a low, steady hum, punctuated by a rhythmic mechanical cough. It was the sound of a pump. They slowed their pace, moving from the cover of one boulder to the next. The trail of mica-flecked mud was thick here, confirming their direction. They rounded a large rock outcropping and saw it, tucked into a narrow part of the canyon, where the rock walls rose steeply on either side, was a squat, formidable structure, a steam-powered pumping station, freshly built from raw timber and sheet metal, sat astride the creek bed. A wide dam of earth and rock had been erected, turning the once flowing creek into a stagnant, muddy pool. From this pool, a large iron pipe, at least 2 feet in diameter, snaked its way up the canyon wall, disappearing over the ridge in the direction of the railroad line. And there, set into the very center of the dam, was the source of all their trouble. A massive iron gate valve, its large spoked wheel gleaming with fresh black paint. It was held fast not by a simple latch, but by a heavy, case-hardened lock, its brass face shining like a malevolent eye in the morning sun. It was new, arrogant, and utterly indifferent to the thirst of the valley below. They watched from the shadows for a long time. The place seemed deserted. The pump chugged along on its own, a mechanical heart beating a rhythm of theft. Tess's eyes scanned the ground. Near the base of the dam, half trodden into the mud, was a small, dark square of fabric. While Dane kept watch, she moved silently and swiftly, her feet making no sound on the soft earth. She snatched it up and returned to the cover of the rocks. It was a piece of oily canvas, the kind a mechanic would use to wipe his hands. The grease on it was fresh, and stenciled in stark black letters across one corner were 2 words, Talon Works. Tess held it to her nose. It smelled of steam, oil, and something else, a sharp, clean scent that cut through the grime. Pine tar. New pine tar. The kind used to seal joints and prevent rust. It was the scent of recent construction. This was their proof. Talon, Dane said, the name a flat, hard stone in the quiet air. Tess looked from the oily rag to the gleaming lock. He's not just diverting the water. He's stealing it outright. Her voice was cold with a controlled fury. She looked at Dane. That lock has to come off. Dane's jaw tightened. He stared at the dam, his expression a conflict of raw anger and ingrained caution. Breaking a lock is a crime. Tess, it's trespassing. It gives Talon the law on his side. Tess turned to face him, her eyes flashing. Locking up the water that this entire town depends on to survive is a bigger crime. Dane, she countered, her voice low but fierce. What law is on our side when our cattle are dying and children are getting sick? There's a higher law than property, and it's the law of staying alive. He met her gaze. He saw the unshakable conviction in her, the absolute certainty of her moral compass. She was not reckless, but she was fearless in a way he had never encountered. She was arguing a point of principle that went beyond fences and deeds. And in the face of her certainty, his own cautious objections felt small, like pebbles against a rock slide. He gave a slow nod. She was right, but they couldn't act now. Not with brute force. They needed more than just a broken lock. They needed evidence. We document it first, Dane said, his voice shifting into a practical, tactical register. Everything, from her medical bag. Tess produced a small, leather-bound notebook and a piece of charcoal. While Dane stood guard, she began to sketch, her hand moving with quick, precise strokes. She drew the dam, the pump house, the massive pipe. She carefully rendered the valve and the lock, noting its size and make. Dane, meanwhile, found a long, straight willow branch. He stripped it of its leaves and, under the guise of an ordinary wanderer, walked down to the edge of the stagnant pool. He pushed the stick down until it hit the creek bed, marking the water level with his thumbnail. He then moved to the downstream side of the dam, where only a pathetic trickle of water escaped. He measured again. The difference was stark. He returned to their hiding place and, using his knife, carved 2 notches into the stick, a clear record of the theft. Tess added the measurements, along with the date and the exact time, to the bottom of her drawing. It was as she was putting the notebook away that she saw him, a man, high on the opposite ridge, half hidden by a juniper tree. He wasn't looking at them, but at the pump house. He carried a rifle, a guard, and then he turned his head. His gaze swept the canyon, and, for a heart-stopping second, it locked directly onto their position. There was no shout, no warning. The man simply raised his rifle to his shoulder. Move. Dane's voice was a harsh whisper. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back behind the large boulder just as the sound of the rifle shot cracked across the canyon, echoing off the rock walls. A chip of stone exploded from the face of the boulder, stinging Tess's cheek. There was no way back the way they came. The guard was above them, with a clear line of sight. Their only path was downstream, along the rocky, exposed bank of the creek. "Run!" Dane commanded. And they ran. They scrambled over the slick, water-worn rocks, their boots slipping, their lungs burning. Another shot rang out, and a bullet whined past Dane's ear. The guard was moving along the ridge, pacing them. They were easy targets. Ahead, the bank dropped away into a shallow, overgrown ravine. It was choked with mesquite, sagebrush, and a thick, impassable stand of prickly pear cactus. It wasn't a path, it was a trap, but it was their only cover. "Down," Dane yelled. He didn't slow. He simply wrapped an arm around her waist, lifting her partially off her feet, and half through, half dragged her with him as he launched himself off the bank. They tumbled down the short, steep incline, landing in a brutal, tangled heap at the bottom of the ravine. The impact drove the air from Tess's lungs, and then the pain came, sharp and searing. She had landed with her arm outstretched, directly into a dense clump of cactus. Dozens of long, needle-sharp spines embedded themselves in her forearm, from her wrist to her elbow. A low cry of pain escaped her lips. Dane was instantly on top of her, shielding her body with his own. He pushed her head down, his hand firm on the back of her neck. "Stay still," he breathed, his face just inches from hers. They could hear the guards' boots crunching on the gravel above them, searching for a sign of where they had gone. They lay motionless, a tangle of limbs in the dirt and thorns. The world narrowed to the sound of their own ragged breathing and the footsteps of the man hunting them. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded, moving further downstream. They waited for 5 more minutes in absolute silence. High above, against the vast, indifferent blue of the sky, 2 vultures began to circle, their dark shapes riding the thermal currents. They were the desert's patient signature, a constant, silent observation of the struggle and survival happening below. Finally, Dane moved. "He's gone," he whispered. He gently helped her sit up. His eyes immediately went to her arm. It was a mess. The sleeve of her shirt was torn, and the skin beneath was studded with the vicious spines, some of them buried deep. Small beads of blood welled up around each puncture. Her face was pale, her jaw set against the pain. "We need to get back," she said through gritted teeth. The journey back to his barn was a slow, painful ordeal. They took a wide, circuitous route, staying in the low ground, speaking only when necessary. The sun was high and hot now, beating down on them. With every step, the thorns in Tess's arm seemed to dig deeper, inside the cool, dim shelter of his barn. Tess finally allowed herself to lean against a support beam, her breathing shallow. Dane brought water from the well. She drank deeply, then poured some onto a clean rag and began to clean the dirt from her arm. "I need to get them out," she said, her voice strained. "They'll fester." She opened her medical bag. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the deep, radiating pain. She took out a pair of fine-tipped forceps and a bottle of carbolic acid. She looked at Dane. "I need more light, and I need you to hold the lantern steady, very steady." He took the lantern from its hook and lit it, adjusting the wick until it cast a bright, unwavering circle of light. He knelt in front of her. She took a deep breath, clenched her teeth, and began the grim work. She started with the shallowest spines, her movements precise despite the pain, but the deeper ones were agony. Each time she probed and pulled, a fresh wave of fire shot up her arm. A sheen of sweat broke out on her forehead. Dane watched, his face carved from granite. His eyes never left her arm, his hand holding the lantern as steady as a rock. He saw the way her knuckles were white as she gripped the forceps, the way she bit her lip to keep from crying out. He said nothing. He offered no useless words of comfort. He simply provided what she had asked for, a steady light in the darkness. He was a silent, unmoving witness to her strength. The last spine was the deepest. When she finally pulled it free, a gasp of pain and relief escaped her. Her arm was bleeding freely now from a dozen small wounds. Without pausing, She threaded a surgical needle. "Hold the light closer," she commanded. And as Dane held the lantern, its glow illuminating the scene with the stark clarity of a stage play, Tess Marlowe began to stitch her own skin back together, her movements practiced and sure, a testament to a will that would not be broken. When she was done, she wrapped the arm tightly in a clean bandage. She leaned her head back against the rough wood of the barn wall, her eyes closed, her body trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of pain. She opened her eyes to find him still watching her. His expression one she had never seen before. It was a look of raw, unguarded respect. "You should rest," was all he said. She shook her head. "No." She pushed herself to her feet and walked over to her medical bag. She took out the notebook with her drawing, now smudged with dirt and a single drop of her own blood. She walked to the large wooden chest where she kept her school supplies, unlocked it with a small key she wore on a chain around her neck, and placed the notebook inside. She closed the lid and turned the key. The click of the lock loud in the silent barn. The evidence was safe. She turned back. Dane was standing by the open barn door, staring out at the harsh afternoon light. His leather work gloves were hanging from a nail on the doorframe, where he had left them when he'd gone to saddle the horse that morning. They were dripping water, soaked from a leaking spot in the roof where the hail had done its damage. He wasn't looking out at the yard. He was staring at the gloves, at their empty, limp shapes. It was as if he were looking at his own hands and seeing them for the first time as things that could be used for something other than just keeping the world at a distance. The moon rose that night not as a gentle pearl, but as a raw, bloody wound in the sky. It was a hunter's moon, swollen and red, casting an unsettling, crimson light over the parched landscape of dry willow. The unnatural color seemed to drain the world of its familiar shades, leaving behind only stark blacks and deep, unsettling reds. In this light, the familiar hills looked like sleeping, blood-soaked beasts. A deep, preternatural quiet had fallen. The night birds were silent, and the usual chorus of coyotes had not yet begun. It was a silence that felt heavy, coiled, like the moment before a rattlesnake strikes. Inside his small cabin, Dane Whitlow sat cleaning his rifle, not because it needed it, but because the methodical work of his hands calmed the unease in his gut. He had spent the afternoon reinforcing the very gate he'd repaired just days before, adding a new, heavier latch as an afterthought. He'd strung a thin wire along the top of the fence posts, a tripwire connected to a cluster of old tin cans balanced on a wooden beam near his barn. It was a poor man's alarm, but in a world of whispers and shadows, it was better than nothing. He had just finished reassembling the rifle when the sound came. It wasn't loud. It was a frantic, discordant clatter, the sound of metal on metal, thin and sharp in the night's deep silence. The tin cans. Dane moved. He didn't hesitate. He didn't waste a second reaching for the rifle. He grabbed the long-bladed skinning knife from its sheath on the wall and was out the door in 3 strides, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth without a sound. The red moonlight showed him everything in stark detail. The new latch on the main corral gate was hanging open, its wood splintered around a fresh pry mark, and beyond it, a dark, churning river of livestock was beginning to flow. A confused and frightened mass of cattle being driven from the relative safety of the corral out into the open range. The stampede had not yet found its full, thunderous voice. It was a low, rumbling confusion, the sound of 100 hooves churning the dust, punctuated by the nervous, questioning bellows of the lead steers. 2 figures on horseback, their faces covered with dark bandanas, were at the back of the herd, waving blankets and shouting, hazing the cattle, pushing them away from the ranch and toward the deep, treacherous chasm known as Cotton Draw. From her tent, Tess had heard the clatter of the cans as well. She was awake, reading by the light of a lantern, the bandaged arm propped on a pillow beside her. The sound was alien, and it was followed moments later by the low, guttural rumble of the disturbed herd. She was at the flap of her tent in an instant, a lantern in her hand. She saw the breached gate, the dark shapes of the riders, and Dane. a lone figure, running not toward the house, but toward the small enclosure where he kept his horse saddled through the night. She didn't think, she acted. She knew what a stampede into cotton draw meant: shattered legs, dead cattle, and financial ruin for a man already hanging on by a thread. It could also mean injury for the man who would surely try to stop it. She turned, grabbed her medical bag, and ran for the mare she kept tethered behind the tent. There was no time for a saddle. She threw a blanket over the horse's back, grabbed a fistful of mane, and hauled herself up, her bag clutched in her hand. By the time she had the horse under control, Dane was already a fast-moving silhouette against the red moon, his powerful horse eating up the ground, racing not to get ahead of the herd, but on a parallel course, toward the one place he might have a chance to turn them: the old wooden bridge spanning the narrowest point of the draw. Tess kicked her mare into a gallop, her heart pounding in time with the horse's hooves. The ground shook. The low rumble of the stampede had now become a deafening thunder. The air was thick with dust, kicked up by hundreds of hooves, turning the red moonlight into a hazy, choking fog. Ahead of them, the cotton draw bridge emerged from the gloom, a skeletal structure of weathered timber and rope. It was their only hope. If the cattle reached the open slopes on the other side, they would be unstoppable, scattering for miles or plunging into the deeper parts of the canyon. Dane reached the bridge 100 yards ahead of the lead steers. He didn't slow. He galloped onto the wooden planks, the horse's hooves making a hollow, drumming thunder that was almost lost in the greater noise of the approaching herd. The entire structure vibrated, the old timbers groaning in protest. Tess was right behind him, her mare shying at the unstable feeling beneath its feet. That's when the first shot rang out. It came from the rocks on the far side of the bridge, a bright orange muzzle flash in the darkness. The bullet tore through the air with a vicious whine and slammed into one of the main support pillars next to Dane's head. Splinters, as large as daggers, exploded from the post. Another shot followed, and then a third. They weren't trying to hit him or the cattle. They were trying to terrorize the animals, to ensure they crossed the bridge in a blind panic. The herd, now smelling the water in the draw below and driven mad by the gunshots, surged forward. The bridge began to buck and sway like a ship in a storm. The lead animals hit the entrance to the bridge, their weight sending a violent shudder through the entire structure. Dane knew he had only seconds. He couldn't turn the herd here. He had to stop them. His eyes darted around, taking in the construction of the bridge. It was old, held together by main beams, but stabilized by thick secondary ropes that kept the left side of the bridge from collapsing into the gorge. In a move of pure, desperate instinct, he kicked his feet free from the stirrups. As his horse galloped across the trembling bridge, he launched himself sideways, leaving the saddle in a fluid leap. He landed with a jarring impact on the narrow wooden railing of the bridge, his boots scraping for purchase. He didn't falter. He pulled the long skinning knife from his belt. The secondary rope was as thick as his wrist. Taut with the strain of the bridge's weight, he began to saw at it, his arm a blur of motion. Bullets whined past him, thudding into the wood around him. Wood splinters rained down, stinging his face and hands. He ignored it all, his entire being focused on the thick, fraying rope. Tess watched in horror and awe. She had reined in her mare at the edge of the bridge, the horse dancing nervously as the structure pitched and groaned. She saw a third masked rider, the one who had been shooting, step out from behind the rocks on the far side. The rope groaned, the strands snapping with a sound like pistol shots. Then, with a great tearing shriek of protesting wood and fiber, it gave way. The entire left side of the bridge, unsupported, collapsed. It didn't fall completely into the draw, but sagged downward at a steep, impossible angle, creating a chaotic, impassable barrier of splintered planks and tangled rope. The lead steers, seeing the path disappear before them, bellowed in fear and tried to turn, crashing into the cattle pressing from behind. But the danger wasn't over. One of the masked men, the one who had been closest to the bridge, took a running leap across the newly formed gap. He landed on the remaining, stable section of the bridge, just a few feet from Dane. The man was big, and he charged forward, a heavy pistol in his hand. Dane, still balanced precariously on the railing, had no time to regain his footing. He simply shoved off, meeting the man's charge head on. They crashed together, a tangle of limbs. The man's pistol went flying, skittering across the planks and disappearing into the darkness of the draw. The two men wrestled, their grunts of effort lost in the cacophony of the terrified herd. They swayed dangerously close to the broken edge of the bridge. Tess knew she had to do something. Her medical bag was useless here. Her eyes fell on the lantern she still held, its flame casting a wild, dancing light. She spurred her horse forward a few paces onto the stable part of the bridge. With a cry, she swung the lantern in a wide arc and threw it with all her strength. It shattered on the wooden planks between the fighting men and the oncoming herd. Kerosene splashed across the damp wood, and with a soft whoosh, a curtain of bright, hungry flames erupted. The fire wasn't large, but it was terrifying. The cattle, already spooked, saw the wall of flame before them and panicked. The forward momentum of the stampede broke. The lead animals turned, crashing back into the herd, their fear of the fire greater than the pressure from behind. A wave of motion reversed through the herd as they turned from the bridge and began to thunder back the way they had come. On the bridge, the firelight illuminated the desperate struggle. Dane was grappling with the masked man, trying to get leverage. The man was strong, his hands like vices. As they struggled, Dane felt a searing, blinding pain shoot up his left arm. The man's grip had found the freshly stitched wound from the cactus thorns. The stitches pulled, and he felt the skin tear. His grip faltered, his fingers going numb with the shock of the pain. He started to slip. Tess saw his face go white in the firelight. She saw his grip loosen. "Dane!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire and the bellows of the retreating cattle. He didn't seem to hear her. His focus was blurred by the white-hot pain. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice a raw, powerful shout. "Dane, look at me! Hold on!" His head snapped up, his eyes glazed with pain. Found hers. For a second, their gazes locked across the flickering flames. In her eyes, he didn't see fear. He saw a command. He saw a mirror of his own will to survive. It was the anchor he needed, a surge of adrenaline, born of something other than just the fight, flooded through him. With a roar, he twisted, putting his full weight into a final, desperate heave. He broke the man's grip and threw him to the planks. Before the man could recover, Dane was on him. He didn't use his fists. He grabbed a piece of a horse's rein that had been singed and broken by the fire, and with a few swift, brutal movements, he bound the man's hands behind his back, pulling the knot tight. It was over. The stampede was retreating, a thundering echo fading into the distance. The fire on the bridge was already starting to die down, starved for fuel on the damp wood. The masked man lay groaning on the planks. The night was suddenly filled with an aching silence, broken only by the crackle of the dying flames and the sound of their own harsh, ragged breathing. Dane pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. Tess slid off her mare and ran to him. The air was thick with the smells of smoke, sweat, and hot metal. Her hand went to his injured arm, but she didn't need to see it to know the damage. His sleeve was dark with fresh blood. They worked together, herding the now subdued and confused cattle back toward the corral. They managed to round up most of them, getting them into a secure pasture just as the red moon began to sink toward the horizon. The work was hot, exhausting, and done in near silence. As the first hints of gray dawn touched the sky, they stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. Below, the broken bridge was a dark scar across the draw. The smoke had cleared. Their bodies ached, and they were covered in soot and grime, their breath clouding in the cool morning air. It was then that they saw him, a lone rider on the far ridge, the one where the gunman had been positioned. The figure sat motionless on his horse, a silhouette against the lightening sky. He watched them for a long moment. Then, without a gesture, he turned his horse and slowly rode away. disappearing into the shadows. Even at that distance, they didn't need to see his face. As the breeze shifted, it carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent across the valley. The clean, sharp smell of pine tar. Price Talon was leaving his calling card. The sun was barely an hour high, but the heat of the day was already building inside the Dry Willow Church. It was not a house of God this morning. It was a courtroom. The pews were packed, men and women crowding shoulder to shoulder, their faces tight with a mixture of fear and hungry curiosity. Men who never removed their hats for anything short of the national anthem clutched them in their laps, their knuckles white. The air was thick with the smells of unwashed wool, dust, and the faint, lingering scent of last Sunday's cheap wax candles. Light streamed through the plain, wavy glass of the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the tense air. At the front, where the pulpit usually stood, a long, rough-hewn table had been set up. Behind it sat Reverend Miller, a man whose stern jaw and clear, unflinching eyes made him as much a judge as a preacher in this land where the law was often a distant rumor. To one side of the table stood Price Talon, flanked by the hired man Dane had bound on the bridge and the town's timid, ineffectual sheriff. Talon looked perfectly at ease, his velvet-collared coat immaculate, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. On the other side stood Dane and Tess. They were a stark contrast. Their clothes were still smudged with the soot and dirt of the previous night's fight. Dane's left arm was in a sling Tess had fashioned from a clean flour sack, his knuckles bruised and swollen. Reverend Miller cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the charged silence. "This is an informal hearing to address the grievances brought by Mr. Whitlow concerning the North Fork Creek and the events of last night." He looked at Dane. "Mr. Whitlow, you and Miss Marlowe have the floor." Tess stepped forward. She carried no weapons, only her leather medical bag. She placed it on the table and unbuckled it, her movements calm and deliberate. The entire room seemed to lean forward as one. First, she laid out the notebook, opening it to the charcoal sketch of the pumping station. The drawing was clear, precise, the work of a steady and observant hand. Next, she placed a small, corked glass vial on the table. Inside was a sample of dark, wet mud, the tiny flecks of mica catching the light and glittering like trapped stars. "This soil was taken from the boots of the men who drove Mr. Whitlow's cattle," she said, her voice clear and even. "Carrying to the back of the church, the mica content matches the soil in the upper canyon, where the railroad has built its dam. It does not match the soil on the Whitlow ranch." Then came the oily, grimy piece of canvas. She held it up so everyone could see the stark, black letters. "Talon Works," she read, her gaze flicking for a moment to Price Talon. "Found at the site of the illegal dam." "Finally." Dane stepped forward. He reached into his coat pocket with his good hand and placed 3 objects on the table. 3 spent brass shell casings. They made a small, definitive clicking sound on the wood. "Pick these up off the bridge," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't need to say more. Everyone in the room had heard the stampede. Everyone had seen the smoke from the fire. A murmur went through the crowd. The evidence was simple, physical, and damning. It told a story anyone on the frontier could understand: theft, intimidation, and violence. Price Talon, however, did not look concerned. He simply smiled his thin, patient smile and stepped forward, producing a folded piece of paper from his inner coat pocket. He handled it with a delicate, almost reverent touch. It was old, the paper yellowed and brittle. The ink faded to a rusty brown. He unfolded it carefully and laid it on the table, a clear space away from Tess's evidence. "This," Talon announced, his voice smooth and confident, "is a legal deed, transferring full and exclusive water rights for the North Fork headwaters to my predecessor, the Central Texas Rail Company. It is signed and dated 1865. He tapped a manicured finger on the bottom of the document. A faint, spidery signature was scrawled there, barely legible. "The signature of Jedediah Kane, the original homesteader of the land, Mr. Whitlow now occupies. The sale was legal, witnessed, and filed. My actions in securing the water source are not theft. They are the execution of a long-standing property right. Reverend Miller leaned forward, peering at the document. And what was the price paid for these rights? Mr. Talon rights to all the water on this side of the valley. Talon's smile widened. The deed stipulates the price quite clearly. Reverend, 1 bottle of premium Kentucky bourbon. The room erupted in whispers. A man's entire future, the lifeblood of his land, sold for a drink. It smelled of deceit, of a drunken man taken advantage of. But the signature was there. A faded, shaky mark that could unravel everything. Reverend Miller held up a hand for silence. He looked from the deed to the evidence Tess and Dane had presented. He was a man caught between the written law, however suspect, and the clear evidence of a crime. "This requires investigation," he declared, his voice booming with pastoral authority. "I am granting a period of 3 days. 3 days for the county surveyor to verify the old survey markers on this deed. 3 days for an impartial party to measure the water flow as it stands. And 3 days to find anyone who can attest to the condition of Jedediah Kane when he signed this paper." He looked directly at Talon, and in that time, an injunction stands. The valve on that dam will be opened. Not all the way, but enough to sustain the livestock in this valley. Is that understood? Talon gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow. "Perfectly. Reverend." The hearing was over, as people began to file out, their voices a low hum of speculation. Dane stood staring at the yellow deed on the table, his face a grim mask. He saw his future drying up, turning to dust, all because of a dead man's thirst for whiskey 30 years ago. He felt a light touch on his good arm. It was Tess. "It's not over," she said softly. "I have debts at the mercantile," he said, his voice flat, his gaze distant. "Feed bills. The price for this new batch of calves won't cover them if I can't fatten them up. Maybe it's better to sell them now. Cut my losses." It was the voice of a man considering surrender. Tess's fingers tightened on his sleeve, a small, fierce gesture. "Don't," she said, her voice intense. "Don't drain your own land dry. Dane, we have 3 days." As they stood there, a small group of ranch hands who had been at the Black Spur the other night pushed past them. One of them, a man with a mean-spirited grin, let his eyes travel from Tess to Dane and back again. He leaned over to his friend and said, just loud enough to be heard, 3 days is a long time. Wonder if it'll be as rough as the night that wasn't gentle." A snort of crude laughter followed. Tess's back went rigid. She didn't flush with shame or anger. She simply turned her head and looked at the men. She didn't glare. She just looked, her gaze level and clear, holding them accountable with nothing more than her own unwavering self-possession. The grins on their faces faltered. They shuffled their feet and moved on, unable to withstand the quiet power of her refusal to be diminished. Dane had heard it too. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He turned from Tess and walked back to the table where Reverend Miller was gathering the papers, without a word. Dane reached into his back pocket and pulled out his heavy leather work gloves. They were stiff and stained with mud and his own dried blood from the fight on the bridge. He laid them on the table, next to the spent shells and the damning deed. The gesture drew the eye of everyone left in the church. He looked at Reverend Miller, but his words seemed aimed at Talon. "Working with bare hands," Dane said, his voice low and steady, "rarely leads you down the wrong path." It was his testimony. A simple creed that stood in stark opposition to Talon's world of twisted contracts and hired guns. It was the truth of a man who built things, against a man who only took them. Price Talon, who had been watching the exchange, gave a short, dismissive laugh. He walked over to Dane, stopping a foot away, his voice a confidential murmur. A noble sentiment, Whitlow, but sentiment doesn't pay bills. When you're ready to discuss a practical solution, a cash offer for your worthless dirt, you know where to find me. He called it a private negotiation, but he said it just loud enough for Tess to hear. He tipped his hat and walked out, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and corruption in his wake. Reverend Miller signed the injunction, his pen scratching loudly on the paper. The temporary order was signed, The valve would be opened, but the victory felt fragile, temporary. 3 days. The words hung in the air, suspended and heavy, like the broken half of the cotton drawbridge. Outside, the sun was bright and hot. The tension from the church spilled out onto the dusty street. But as Dane and Tess stood on the church steps, a different sound reached them. The sound of children, released from their lessons in Tess's tent, chasing each other in a game of tag around the town well. Their high, carefree laughter filled the air, a stark and poignant contrast to the low, worried murmurs of their parents. It was the sound of what was at stake, the sound of hope, inextricably mixed with the distant, gathering sound of a coming storm. The injunction was a piece of paper, and Price Talon was a man who knew how to make paper burn. The valve at the dam had been opened, as ordered, but only a fraction of a turn. The trickle of water in the North Fork Creek was now a slightly more robust trickle, enough to keep the cattle from dying, but not enough to banish the specter of thirst that haunted the valley. It was a gesture of compliance that was, in its meagerness, an act of pure contempt. The 3-day reprieve felt less like a chance and more like a countdown to ruin. But Tess Marlowe was not a woman who waited for ruin. On the morning of the first day, she did not open her school for lessons in reading and arithmetic. Instead, she put up a new sign, hand-lettered on a piece of clean pine board, "Dry Willow Water Fair." The idea was born of a simple, powerful truth. Talon was isolating them, making each rancher's thirst their own private misery. The only way to fight back was together. She started by taking her own carefully hoarded supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, and setting them up on a table outside her tent. The first people to arrive were the mothers of her students, their face etched with worry. "What's this?" Miss Marlowe, one of them asked, gesturing to the supplies. "This is a fair," Tess announced, her voice ringing with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "No money needed. We trade for what we need. A pie for a bucket of water from the town well, a mended shirt for a share of milk. But most importantly, we share information." She had taken the notched measuring stick Dane had made in the canyon and driven it into the creek bed behind her tent. Now, she led the small group of women to it. "This is our truth," she said, pointing to the pitifully low watermark. "Every hour, we will mark it. We will create a record that no one can dispute. We are not just victims of a drought. We are witnesses to a crime. I will teach anyone who wants to learn how to read the marks." It started slowly, but as the sun climbed higher, the idea took root. People began to arrive, not just with goods to trade, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Women brought pies, loaves of bread, and jars of preserves. Men brought tools, offering to mend a broken harness or sharpen a dull blade in exchange for a full water barrel for their families. The air, which for days had been thick with suspicion and fear, now filled with the sounds of bartering, of children's laughter, and the steady, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Flour dusted the cheeks of playing children. The smell of baking bread mingled with the scent of hot iron and dust. It was a small, fragile rebellion, fought with pies and measuring sticks. Dane Whitlow arrived not with goods to trade, but with his wagon, loaded with a strange assortment of what looked like junk, an old, broken wagon wheel, a long, coiled length of leather belting, a dozen empty tin buckets. He didn't speak to the crowd. He walked straight to the creek, to a spot where the bank was steep, and began to unload. The town watched in curious silence as he worked. He was a man of few words, but his hands spoke a language of pure, practical genius. Using a post-hole digger, he set 2 heavy posts deep into the muddy bank. He mounted the old wagon wheel between them on a greased axle. He attached the tin buckets to the rim of the wheel with wire. Then, he ran the long leather belt from the makeshift water wheel to a smaller wheel he attached to a hand crank. It was a crude, improbable machine, a thing of scrap and ingenuity. When it was finished, he began to turn the crank. The large wheel groaned, turned, and the first bucket dipped into the meager creek. It came up, dripping, holding perhaps a quart of precious water. As the wheel turned, the bucket rose, tipped, and spilled its contents into a long wooden trough he had positioned to run back toward his parched pasture. It wasn't a flood. It was barely a stream, but it was more than was there before. It was an act of defiance. It was a man refusing to let his world die. Inspired. Other men came forward. They didn't ask. They just started helping. They held the posts while he secured them. They helped him align the trough. They took turns at the crank, their faces grim with effort, the sweat beading on their brows. For the first time, Dane Whitlow was not alone in his fight. He worked among them, giving quiet, clipped instructions, a leader not by voice, but by action. The rhythmic turning of the wheel and the splash of water into the trough became the heartbeat of the fair. The day was a success. It filled their bellies and their water barrels. More importantly, it filled the empty spaces between them with a sense of shared purpose. But Tess and Dane knew it wasn't enough. They had bought themselves a little time, a little hope, but they had not yet won the war. The real work had to be done under the cover of darkness. That night, after the town had settled into an exhausted sleep, they met by the skeletal remains of the Cotton Draw Bridge. The moon was a thin, silver sliver, providing little light. They were both dressed in dark clothing, their face smudged with dirt to reduce the chance of being seen. "There's a secondary release valve on the main pump," Dane said, his voice a low whisper. "It's for maintenance. If we can open it, even for a few minutes, the pressure drop will be recorded on their own gauge. It'll prove the main valve is almost completely shut. It's the legal evidence Miller needs." "How do we get past the guard?" Tess asked, her hand instinctively going to her bandaged arm, which still ached with a dull fire. "We don't," Dane replied. "He patrols the ridge. We go up the creek bed. It's colder, wetter, but he won't see us." The journey up the canyon was a tense, shivering ordeal. They moved through the shallow, frigid water, the mud sucking at their boots with every step. The towering rock walls on either side seemed to press in on them, amplifying the sound of their own breathing. Every dislodged pebble sounded like a landslide. When they reached the dam, the place was a fortress of shadows. The pump house was a dark, hulking shape, its rhythmic coughing the only sound besides the gurgle of the water. High on the ridge above, they could see the faint, glowing tip of the guard's cheroot, a tiny orange star moving back and forth. They stayed low, using the dam itself for cover, and slipped around to the back of the pump house. Dane pointed to a small, secondary valve wheel near the base of the main pipe, almost hidden in the shadows. It was rusted and stiff. Dane put his shoulder to it and heaved. The wheel didn't budge. He tried again, his boots slipping in the mud, a low grunt of effort escaping his lips. "Let me," Tess whispered. From her medical bag, she produced a small bottle of lubricating oil. It was for delicate instruments, but it would have to do. She carefully dripped the oil onto the rusted bolt. They waited a minute. Then Dane tried again, this time with a great grating shriek of protesting metal. The wheel began to turn. It was agonizingly slow, each inch a victory. It was the noise that betrayed them. High on the ridge, the orange star of the cheroot stopped moving. A moment later, they heard the crunch of boots on gravel, coming closer. He had heard the screech. "Down!" Dane hissed. He grabbed her, not by the arm this time, but around the waist, pulling her with him as he slid down the muddy bank into a shallow, water-filled ditch at the base of the dam. It was less a hiding place and more a depression in the earth, offering scant cover. He pushed her down flat, then covered her body with his own, pressing them both deep into the cold, wet mud. The icy water soaked through their clothes instantly. A shocking, breathless cold. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Crunch, pause, crunch. The guard was directly above them now, just on the other side of the earthen dam. Tess held her breath, her face pressed against the rough, wet fabric of Dane's coat. The world shrank to this tiny, dark, freezing space. She could feel the solid, steady beat of Dane's heart against her back, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of her own. She could smell the scent of the damp earth, of cold iron, and of him. It was a clean, honest scent of sweat and resolve. The footsteps stopped. An eternity seemed to pass. Tess imagined the man standing just feet away, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the darkness. Then, a match scraped against stone. The sudden flare of light made her flinch. The guard was relighting his cheroot. The scent of sulfur and sweet tobacco drifted down to them. After another long moment, the footsteps resumed, moving away, continuing their patrol. They didn't move until the sound had faded completely into the distance. Dane slowly pushed himself up, the sucking mud reluctant to release them. They were both soaked to the bone, shivering, their teeth chattering. "We have to finish," Dane whispered, his voice tight with cold and tension. They scrambled back up the bank. This time, they both put their hands on the wheel and pushed. Together, with a final, groaning complaint, the valve opened. It was not a roar of water, but a deep, powerful, surging hiss as the immense pressure in the pipe found a new release. The water gushed out, forming a new, fast-moving stream that joined the pathetic trickle below the dam. It was the sound of life, of a promise being kept. They let it run for a full 2 minutes, counting off the seconds in their heads. It was long enough to register, long enough to create a record. Then, they closed it, the work of shutting it just as hard as opening it. As they were about to slip back into the darkness of the creek bed, Tess's hand, searching for a grip in the mud, brushed against something small, hard, and round. Her fingers closed around it. It was a metal washer, thick and heavy for its size, even in the dim light. She could see a number stamped into its surface, 3/8. It seemed an insignificant thing, a piece of mechanical detritus. But she knew from helping her father that every part of a machine had a purpose, and that specific sizes were often unique to specific manufacturers. She slipped it into her pocket without a word. The journey back was a blur of cold and exhaustion. They didn't speak. All their energy was focused on putting one foot in front of the other. As they cleared the mouth of the canyon and saw the lights of Dry Willow, they saw something else. Figures, dozens of them. The entire town, it seemed, was waiting for them, standing in silent vigil by the creek bed, holding lanterns that cast a warm, hopeful glow in the pre-dawn gloom. As they stumbled out of the darkness, soaked and muddy, a quiet cheer went through the crowd. Someone handed Tess a warm blanket. Another person pressed a hot tin of coffee into Dane's hand. No one asked what they had done. They didn't have to. They could hear it, for the first time in weeks. The North Fork Creek was running with a steady, musical murmur. The water, released from the pump, was reaching them. The sound was like a long, collective sigh of relief from the heavens themselves. Everyone was wet from the rising creek, and everyone was smiling. Later, in the quiet solitude of his barn, Dane sat on a hay bale, trying to warm himself by a lantern. Tess was there, cleaning and repacking her medical bag, her movements efficient despite her shivering. She had insisted on checking the stitches on his arm, which had held this time. He took off his work gloves, soaked through and heavy with mud, and dropped them to the packed dirt floor. They landed with a soft thud. Tess looked up. She set her medical bag down on the floor beside them. The two objects lay there, side by side in the golden lantern light. The rough, stained leather of his world, and the ordered, tool-filled bag of hers. Two different worlds, two different ways of fighting, resting together on the common ground they had just defended. They had touched. The Black Spur Saloon was Price Talon's throne room. It was where he held court, dispensed whiskey, and wove his web of promises and threats. By the evening of the second day, the place was buzzing. The story of the town's water fair and the miraculous overnight rise in the creek's flow had spread, but it was laced with Talon's own version of events that he'd graciously opened the valve as a sign of good faith. The mood was a volatile mix of hope and suspicion, and the laughter of Talon's hired men was just a little too loud, a little too sharp. The swinging doors of the saloon creaked open. The noise and laughter did not stop, but it faltered, sputtering out like a faulty lamp as every head in the room turned. Tess Marlowe stood in the doorway. She was not supposed to be here. This was a place of men, of smoke and spit and cheap liquor. A respectable woman, let alone the town's teacher and healer, did not cross this threshold. She was dressed simply, her hair tied back, her face clean of the trail's dust, but set with an expression of unwavering resolve. The gossips who had whispered about her and Whitlow in the mud now fell silent, their eyes wide. She did not wait for an invitation. She walked directly to the center of the room, to the large poker table where Price Talon sat with the sheriff and two of his men. The air crackled with a sudden, sharp tension. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Tess looked directly at Talon, her gaze ignoring the others at the table. "I'm told this is a place for games of chance. Mr. Talon," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with perfect clarity in the now silent room. "I'd like to propose a game. Not with cards. With evidence." Talon leaned back in his chair, a slow, amused smile spreading across his face. He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Miss Marlowe, to what do we owe this unexpected pleasure? By all means, play your hand." Tess did not sit. She remained standing, a position of authority. She placed her worn leather medical bag on the green felt of the table. From it, she removed the items she and Dane had collected, laying them out one by one as a card sharp might deal a hand. First, the oily canvas rag with the words "Talon Works" stenciled in black. Second, her notebook, open to the detailed sketch of the pumping station. Third, the glass vial of mud, the mica within it glittering under the smoky yellow light of the oil lamps. And last, a small, heavy object that she placed in the center of the table with a definitive click. The 3/8-inch metal washer. "These are my cards, Mr. Talon," she said. The men at the table stared at the objects, a strange collection of junk that seemed meaningless. But at the bar, a man who had been quietly nursing a beer suddenly straightened up. He was a railroad man, a mechanic named Silas, his face permanently smudged with grease. He squinted at the washer. Tess saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Silas," she said, her voice even. "You work on the steam engines. You know the machinery the railroad uses." Silas looked nervously from Tess to Talon, who was now watching him with cold, reptilian eyes. The mechanic swallowed hard. He was a quiet man, not a brave one, but he was an honest one. He picked up the washer, turning it over in his calloused fingers. "This," he began, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat. "This is a custom-milled compression washer, from the high-pressure gaskets. We don't use these on the locomotives. They're a special order. Only the new water pumps use them." He looked at Talon, then quickly looked away, placing the washer back on the table. "Only Mr. Talon's new equipment uses that size." The connection was made. The small, insignificant piece of metal was now a link in a chain, connecting the dam directly to the man sitting at the table. Just then, the saloon doors swung open again. This time, it was Dane Whitlow. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed to fill the room. He walked past the silent tables of men and stopped beside Tess. He wasn't looking at Talon. He was looking at the bar. With his good hand, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his work gloves. They were stiff and stained, a testament to a life of hard labor. He didn't drop them. He placed them, carefully, on the polished wood of the bar top. It was a statement. Then he turned. "To hold water," Dane said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards, "is to hold a life." Price Talon's smile never wavered. He seemed to be enjoying the drama, a compelling performance from you both, a veritable traveling show. He reached into his coat and, with a theatrical flourish, produced the yellowed, brittle deed. He spread it flat on the table, over Tess's drawing. "But I prefer games of law to games of chance. This document, a legally executed transfer of rights, trumps your collection of trinkets. The water is mine. The law is on my side. The law requires a willing and competent seller," Tess countered, her voice ringing with a new strength. "Was Jedediah Kane competent when he signed that paper?" Talon laughed. A short, sharp bark. "The man has been dead for 30 years. Who could possibly say I can?" said a voice from the doorway. The crowd turned. Framed in the entrance, leaning on a simple wooden cane, was Nora Gates. She was the oldest woman in Dry Willow, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her eyes a pale, faded blue but still sharp and clear. She had lived in this valley since it was nothing but open range and a dream. Tess stepped back from the table, giving the old woman a clear path. Nora was a serving girl in the original saloon on this very spot, the night that deed was signed. She was there, slowly, her cane thumping a steady rhythm on the floorboards. Nora walked to the table. She looked down at the faded signature. "Jedediah," she said, her voice thin and reedy, but carrying an undeniable weight of truth. He was a good man with a weak spirit. The railroad man. The one before Mr. Talon. He kept Jedediah drunk for a week, poured whiskey down his throat until he couldn't see the sun at noon. She looked up, her faded eyes finding Talon's. I was the one who handed Jedediah the pen. His hand was shaking so bad he couldn't hold it. The railroad man had to guide his hand to make the mark. She tapped a bony finger on the signature. That isn't a signature. It's a ghost. He didn't sell his water rights. He drowned them in a bottle of whiskey that wasn't even his. A low, angry murmur swept through the room. The story felt true in a way Talon's legal document never could. It was a story of the strong preying on the weak. A story they all understood. The tide of opinion, so carefully controlled by Talon, was turning, fast and hard. Talon's smile finally vanished, replaced by a flash of fury in his eyes. The big man Dane had captured on the bridge, the one who'd been standing behind Talon, took a step forward. He was aiming for the table, to scatter the evidence, to intimidate the old woman. Dane moved to intercept him, but he didn't raise his fists. He simply stepped into the man's path, a silent, immovable object. He looked the bigger man directly in the eye. "Outside," Dane said. The word was not a shout. It was a low, flat command, stripped of all emotion. It was more terrifying than any threat. It was a statement of absolute certainty. The hired man hesitated, his bravado failing him in the face of Dane's cold calm. He looked to Talon for a signal, but Talon's face was a mask of cold fury. The henchman, feeling his authority challenged, sneered. "I ain't going nowhere." He never finished the sentence. Dane's good hand shot out, not in a punch, but in an open-handed shove to the chest. It wasn't a blow meant to injure, but to move. It sent the man stumbling backward a few steps. The message was clear. You are not in control here. Dane turned his back on the man and walked to the swinging doors, holding one open. He waited. The entire saloon held its breath, humiliated. The hired man had no choice. With a curse, he stomped toward the door. As he passed, Dane followed him out into the red dust of the street. The saloon emptied onto the porch in a silent, jostling wave, under the cold, distant light of the stars. The two men faced each other. The hired man postured, rolling his shoulders, trying to reclaim his lost dominance. He charged, throwing a wild, clumsy punch. Dane didn't meet it. He moved aside, letting the man's momentum carry him past. As the man stumbled, Dane struck. It wasn't a barroom brawl. It was a swift, brutal, and efficient dismantling. A short, hard blow to the stomach that drove the air from the man's lungs. As the man doubled over, gasping, Dane delivered a single, precise chop to the side of his neck. The big man crumpled, collapsing into the dust not with a bang, but with a soft, final sigh. He wasn't dead, but he was done. Dane stood over him for a moment, his breathing even, then turned and walked back into the saloon, leaving the man to groan in the dirt. He walked back to the table. The silence inside was absolute. Reverend Miller, who had entered during the commotion, stood near the end of the bar, his face grim. He had seen enough. In the absence of a formal circuit judge, Miller announced, his voice filling the room with its old authority, "I am the acting magistrate of this community. Based on the credible testimony of Nora Gates, I find the deed presented by Mr. Talon to be invalid, having been signed under duress and incapacitation." He pointed a stern finger at Talon. "Furthermore, based on the evidence presented by Miss Marlowe and Mr. Whitlow. I find you, Price Talon, guilty of the illegal impoundment of a public water source and willful destruction of property. He slammed his hand down on the bar. The injunction is made permanent. The valve on that dam will be opened fully, immediately. A fine of $500 is levied against you for damages. The saloon was so quiet you could hear the soft hiss of the oil lamps. In that stark, unforgiving light, something became visible that had been hidden in the shadows. On the shoulders and sleeves of Price Talon's fine, velvet-collared coat, clinging to the expensive fabric, was a fine, silvery dusting. It glittered under the lamplight. It was mica, the dust of the upper canyon, the very proof of his presence at the scene of the crime, was on him. He was branded by the very land he had tried to steal. Talon stood up slowly. His face was pale, his composure shattered, replaced by a look of pure, venomous hatred. He looked at Dane, then at Tess. He said nothing. He turned and strode out of the saloon, pushing through the stunned crowd. In the ringing silence of his departure, Tess finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her part was played. The fight was won. She looked across the table at Dane. He was watching her, his gray eyes stripped of their usual guard. In that moment, in the smoky, yellow light of the Black Spur Saloon, their eyes met and held. No words were needed. The noise of the world, the whispers and the threats, all faded away. There was only this shared space, this silent understanding. Her gaze was steady, clear, and it held a truth her lips had not yet dared to form. It said, "Of all the men in this hard, broken world, I choose you." The day after the victory at the Black Spur Saloon, a stillness settled over Dry Willow. It was the quiet of a fever that has finally broken, leaving the patient weak but blessedly lucid. The North Fork Creek, now running full and clear, provided a constant, soothing murmur, a sound of life restored. The air itself seemed lighter, the dust less oppressive. It was into this quiet that the letter arrived. It came with the weekly supply wagon from the east, a crisp, clean envelope of heavy paper addressed in a precise, elegant script to Miss Teresa Marlowe. The postmark read Santa Morena. She opened it in the privacy of her tent, the canvas walls glowing with the soft morning light. The letter was from a doctor, Alistair Finch, the chief physician of the newly established Santa Morena Parochial Hospital. He had heard of her work in the territories, of her skill and her resilience. He was offering her a position, head nurse of the women's ward. The salary he quoted was more than double what she could ever hope to earn from the bartered pies and mended shirts of Dry Willow. The offer included a small, clean house with whitewashed walls, a proper well in the yard, and access to a medical library. It was an offer of a different life, a life of order, of science, of clean sheets and reliable water, a life where she would not have to fight for every drop of hope, where she could simply be a healer, not a warrior. She read the letter twice, the heavy paper cool and smooth in her hands. It felt like a missive from another world, a world she had almost forgotten existed. She thought of a real bed, of glass in the windows, of a roof that didn't leak in a hailstorm. The temptation was a physical thing, a pull as real and undeniable as gravity. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, the clean edges of the paper a stark contrast to the rough denim of her trousers. She walked outside, her gaze drawn west, toward Dane Whitlow's ranch. He was not at the cabin. She found him down by the pasture, not far from the water wheel he had built. He had spent the morning digging a new, deeper irrigation channel, and now he was finishing the last section of a long wooden trough that led from the channel to the cattle's drinking station. The sound of his hammer was a steady, rhythmic beat in the quiet morning. Water, clear and abundant, flowed down the new trough, spilling into the basin with a sound like music. He saw her approach and stopped his work, laying the hammer aside. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften. He gestured with his chin toward the trough. The sunlight glittered on the moving water, making it look like a ribbon of diamonds. The calves, no longer gaunt and desperate, drank their fill, their sides sleek and healthy. "It's running true," he said. It was a simple statement of fact, but it held the weight of all they had fought for. She stood beside him, watching the water flow. The paper in her pocket felt heavy, like a stone. He seemed to sense the turmoil in her. He looked from the flowing water to her face, his gray eyes seeing more than she ever showed. "I heard a story once," he said, his voice a low rumble, "about a woman who didn't need gentle, said she needed things to be rough, to be real." He was not mocking her words from that desperate night in the mud. He was honoring them. He was telling her that he had seen her, truly seen her, in that moment of crisis. He was telling her he understood. And in that moment, a sudden, sharp fear pierced through Tess. It was a fear more profound than facing down a gunman or a stampede. It was the fear of disappearing. She had fought so hard for her independence, to be her own person in a world that tried to define women as nothing more than an extension of a man. To stay here, to accept the unspoken thing that was growing between them, felt like a surrender. She saw her future laid out. She would become the rancher's wife. Her life, her skills, her very name would be absorbed into his. She would dissolve into his world, like a spoonful of salt in a river. The clean little house in Santa Morena, the job with her own title, seemed to call to her, a promise not just of comfort, but of selfhood. Dane watched the conflict on her face. He was a man who understood the language of silence, who could read the weather in a person's eyes. He saw her fear, her hesitation. He turned and started walking, not toward his cabin, but toward an old, dilapidated structure on the far side of the barn. It was a long-abandoned stable, its roof sagging, its wood weathered to a silver gray. He stopped before the heavy, splintered door and slid the thick wooden bolt. He pulled the door open. It groaned on its rusted hinges, revealing an interior filled with the dusty, golden light slanting through the gaps in the walls. It smelled of old hay, forgotten leather, and the dry, clean scent of aged wood. He didn't look at her. He looked into the empty space. "I'm not asking you to move into my house," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I'm not asking for a wife to cook my meals." He turned then, and his gaze met hers, direct and unwavering. "I'm asking for a partner. We could build it here, together." He gestured to the empty stable. "A proper clinic for this town. Solid floor, glass in the windows. Your name on the sign, not mine." Tess stared at him, the words echoing in the quiet space between them. Your name on the sign. It was the most profound, most radical offer she had ever received. He was not asking her to join his world. He was offering to help her build her own, right here, beside his. He was offering her not a cage, however gilded, but a foundation. The fear in her chest did not vanish, but it receded, replaced by something new, something warm and expansive. A choice, a real choice. They started work the next day. The sound of construction became the new rhythm of the ranch. Dane, with his methodical skill, tore out the old, rotten stalls. Tess, with her eye for order, drew up the plans, laying out a main examination room, a small dispensary, and a corner that would be reserved for books. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. The rasp of a handsaw, the sharp report of a hammer, the scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air. They planed the rough boards for the floor until they were smooth under their bare hands. They framed in a new, larger window that would face the morning sun. The town, seeing the new structure taking shape, began to contribute. It was a quiet, organic process. One afternoon, a group of the men Dane had worked beside at the water wheel arrived, carrying heavy posts to reinforce the new water troughs, setting them deep in the earth so they would last for a generation. The mothers, bringing their children for checkups, would leave behind a jar of wild honey or a clutch of fresh eggs on the growing stack of new lumber. The children, her students, began to arrive in a slow, shy procession, each one carrying a book, a worn copy of a primer, a tattered book of fables, a family Bible to start the new library. They were not just building a clinic, they were weaving a community back together, board by board, book by book. One afternoon, Tess was ready to hang the sign she had painstakingly painted. It was a simple, long plank of smooth pine, with elegant black letters that read, "Clinic Library, Dry Willow." As Dane held it steady for her to nail into place, he paused. He walked into the nearly finished building and went to the nail on the wall where his old work gloves had been hanging. They were the gloves from the fight on the bridge, stiff with dried blood and mud, the leather torn and battered. He took them down and walked back to her. He didn't hang them outside. He went back inside and drove a new nail into the clean, fresh-smelling pine of the interior wall, just inside the door. He hung the gloves there. They were no longer a tool for work. They were an artifact, a memorial to a night of fire and fear, a souvenir of the cold, muddy darkness where their partnership had truly been forged. Tess watched him. Then, she walked over to the nail. She reached into her pocket, not for the letter from Santa Morena, but for the simple, white handkerchief she always carried. She carefully unfolded it and tucked it behind the stiff leather of the gloves. Its clean, white linen, a stark contrast to the dark, battered hide. It was her own statement. Her things. Here, in this place they had built, placed there by her own hand, without asking permission. On the dawn of the third day, a wagon was seen leaving Dry Willow, heading east. It moved quickly, pulling a long, lonely plume of dust behind it. Price Talon had sold his railroad shares to an investor from back east for a fraction of their worth and had vanished in the night, leaving nothing behind but a bad taste in the town's memory and a trail of dust that the morning breeze soon erased. That afternoon, the town held a small celebration. It wasn't a loud, drunken party at the saloon. It was a quiet gathering by the banks of the now gurgling North Fork. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought a fresh-baked apple pie. They didn't use glasses. They passed around a simple wooden dipper, and each person, man, woman, and child, drank directly from the creek. The water so cold and clean it made their teeth ache. Everyone was thirsty, and everyone smiled, their faces wet with the water they had won back. Later that evening, Tess sat at the small desk in the nearly finished clinic. The air smelled of sawdust and hope. The setting sun streamed through the new, clean glass of the window, bathing the room in a warm, honey-colored light. She took out a fresh sheet of paper, her inkwell, and her pen. She also took out the letter from Santa Morena. Reading it one last time, it was a good life it offered, a safe life. Then, she put it aside. She dipped her pen in the ink, the nib making a soft scratching sound in the quiet room. She began to write to Dr. Alistair Finch. She thanked him for his generous offer. She wished him well in his work. And then, with a deep and certain sense of rightness, she, politely and firmly, declined his position. She signed her name at the bottom of the page. The ink flowed, dark and permanent. And as she wrote, she noticed, with a kind of distant wonder, that her hand was not shaking at all. The sunset poured over the high plains like warm honey, thick and golden, filling every ravine and arroyo with a soft, forgiving light. The harsh edges of the world seemed to dissolve. The land, which had been a study in bleached bone and thirsty dust, now held the deep, rich colors of a new bruise, the dark, damp earth along the creek banks, the vibrant green of new shoots of grass. The North Fork, no longer a ghost of itself, ran with a full and steady voice, its surface catching the last of the day's light and shattering it into 1,000 glittering shards, like a gentle blade laid across the valley. Dane Whitlow walked toward the new clinic, his long shadow stretching out before him. His steps were unhurried, the weariness in his bones a good earned thing, the ache of building, not of fighting. He walked through a world remade, his calves fat and content, grazed peacefully in the pasture, their low bellows a soft counterpoint to the music of the creek. The air itself felt different, washed clean, carrying not the scent of fear and dust, but the clean, sharp fragrance of wild mint growing along the water's edge, and the familiar, comforting smell of sun-warmed leather from the harnesses hanging by the barn. He stopped at the door of the clinic. The new sign, Clinic Library, Dry Willow, was a dark, solid shape against the glowing wood. A small brass bell Tess had salvaged from a broken school clock was hung from the doorframe, and it tinkled softly in the evening breeze. a sound of welcome, of civilization. The building was more than just wood and nails. It was the heart of the town's new life, and she was its center. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Tess was at the far window, looking out at the sunset, her silhouette framed by the golden light. The room smelled of fresh pine, carbolic acid, and the faint, papery scent of the books that now lined a set of shelves along one wall. She turned as he entered, a soft smile touching her lips. He did not speak. Instead, he stopped just inside the door, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached up and pulled off his heavy leather work gloves. It was an act she had seen him perform 100 times, but it was different now. It was no longer just the habit of a man coming in from his work. It had become a ritual, a gesture of transition. It was the shedding of the armor he wore against the world, an act of making himself vulnerable, of coming home. He hung the gloves on the nail beside the door, beside her own white handkerchief, and only then did he walk toward her. He stopped before her, his bare hands hanging at his sides. They were large, powerful hands, cross-hatched with a lifetime of scars, the knuckles thick, the palms layered with calluses. But they were the same hands that had shielded a newborn calf from a storm, that had heaved a wagon from the mud, that had held her wrist with such steady warmth until the trembling stopped. Tess looked from his hands to his face, his gray eyes holding hers in the dimming light. She remembered that night, the rain and the mud, the boy's life hanging by a thread, the desperate words she had spoken. They had been a command born of crisis, but they had also been a truth she hadn't known she possessed. "I still don't want gentle tonight," she whispered, the words a soft echo in the quiet room. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I want real." A slow smile spread across Dane's face. It was not the quick, sharp grin of other men. It was a deep and quiet thing, a warmth that started in his eyes and moved outward, softening the hard lines of his face. He reached out, his calloused hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones with a tenderness that was so profound it made her breath catch. "Then we'll make it real," he said, his voice a low, steady promise. He looked into her eyes, and she saw their future reflected there, not as an easy dream, but as a piece of land to be worked, a foundation to be built. Tomorrow and the year after, he leaned in, and she met him halfway. They came together not in a rush of passion, but in a moment of deep, quiet recognition. Their first kiss was short, solid, and warm. It was not hurried. It was as patient and as real as the land itself. It tasted of dust and clean water, of sweat and honest labor. It was a kiss that asked for nothing and promised everything. When they parted, they did not move away. They simply stood there, their foreheads touching, breathing the same air, their shared silence more intimate than any words. Outside, the world continued its gentle evening rhythm. A calf bellowed for its mother. The wind sighed through the eaves of the new building, making the small bell chime again. A single, clear note. The sign Dane had helped her hang creaked softly, a sound like a contented breath. The creek flowed on, its current steady and deep, and in their chests, they could feel their own hearts beating with the same sure, unwavering rhythm. The town of Dry Willow was changing. The gossips in the mercantile still talked, but they spoke less of scandal and suspicion, and more of the price of lumber and the best time to plant a kitchen garden. The bitter rivalries born of thirst had been washed away, replaced by the shared work of digging irrigation ditches and reinforcing the creek's banks. Love, in this hard country, was not a delicate flower. It was a stubborn, deep-rooted thing, like the cottonwood trees that thrived along the water, its strength drawn not from soft words and easy promises, but from the shared labor of surviving, of building. It had planted its roots in the wet, fertile soil of their common ground, and on the nail just inside the door, the old, battered pair of work gloves hung in the fading light. They were a silent testament, a quiet reminder. Their leather was stained with mud and blood, scarred by cactus thorns and singed by the fire on the bridge. They told a story of a struggle won not with laws or guns alone, but with raw, unyielding courage. They were a monument to a simple truth, learned in the dark and the cold, that all the most enduring tenderness, all the gentleness that truly matters, begins with the courage to be rough, to be real, to first take off the gloves. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to give this story an extra boost, hit that hype button to help it be heard by more people.